In this video, I'm going to talk about classifications of carbohydrates. In my last video, I explored the concept of carbohydrates, the definitions, the functions, and as well the importance of carbohydrates to man. So in this video, I will basically be talking about the classifications of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are also known as polyhydroxyl aldehyde or ketone or compound that can produce them on hydrolysis. And at the same time, carbohydrates are they are carbohydrates. They are mostly referred to as carbohydrates. So in this video, I will be focusing on the classifications of carbohydrates based on number of sugar units. That's the first point I'm going to explain here of sugar units that are present. And at the same time, I'll be explaining the classifications of carbohydrates based on functional group. Now let's start. And as far as based on the number of sugar units is concerned, don't forget that we basically call carbohydrates carbohydrates. And one thing about carbohydrates is that it can be further classified into three major groups, which are: the first one is the monosaccharide, right? Monosaccharides, that's the first major group that you can have. The second group that you can have is the case of oligosaccharide, right? Oligosaccharide. And the third one that we can have is actually the case of what? Of polysaccharide. Now, whenever you see the word saccharide, don't panic, you understand? So whenever we are talking about saccharides, saccharides simply means sugar, right? Saccharide simply means sugar, something that is sweet to taste, right? That is what is referred to as saccharide. Now, carbohydrates can be classified into three major groups. We have the monosaccharide, the oligosaccharide, and the polysaccharide. Although sometimes we always classify it into four major groups. They will classify monosaccharide, right? Then they will classify oligosaccharide, but before oligosaccharide, they are going to talk about disaccharides, right? But one thing about disaccharide is that disaccharides is a type of oligosaccharide. It's a type of oligosaccharide. So we don't really need to waste much time on disaccharide. Although I'm still going to explain it in a separate video, but just know that carbohydrates can be classified based on the number of sugar units, and they can be classified into three major groups, which are the monosaccharide, the oligosaccharide, and the polysaccharide. Now, as far as monosaccharide is concerned, whenever we are talking about monosaccharide, we are talking about one sugar unit, right? After all, mono simply means one, right? It simply means one. Then saccharide simply means what? Sugar. So you simply say monosaccharide are what? They contain one sugar unit, right? Then apart from that, what are the properties of monosaccharide? The common properties of monosaccharide is just that monosaccharides are actually sweet to taste. They are sweet to taste, right? They are soluble. Exactly. They are as well soluble, and they are what? They are crystalline in structure. That's one thing about monosaccharide. So they are very, very sweet to taste. They are soluble. And example of monosaccharide includes, we have the case of what? Of glucose. We have glucose. We have the case of we have fructose. We have fructose. We have dihydroxyacetone. Right? We have another example. We have the case of ribose, right? We have the case of raffinose. But one thing about raffinose is that raffinose is not a monosaccharide actually. It is an oligosaccharide. But I'm going to explain it when I get there. Then we have the case of ribose, which is a monosaccharide as well. We have the case of ribulose. Ribulose is as well a monosaccharide. Then another one that we have the case of galactose. Galactose is also as well a monosaccharide. We have the case of what? Of mannose. Mannose as well is a monosaccharide. So we have the case of xylulose. So we have the case of xylulose. We have the case of glyceraldehyde. We have the case of glyceraldehyde. So these are actually different types of monosaccharide that you can have. And one thing about monosaccharide is that monosaccharide can further be classified based on the number of carbon atoms, because you can have different monosaccharide, and the simplest monosaccharide that you can have is that of 3 carbon atoms. That is monosaccharide that contain 3 carbon atoms. They are the simplest monosaccharide that you can have. For example, the case of this in the case of this dihydroxyacetone, disaccharide, and also what, dihydroxyacetone, they are both 3 carbon atom monosaccharide, right? So just make sure you take note of this important fact. Carbohydrates are actually, they contain monosaccharide contain 1 sugar unit. That's the first fact. They are sweet to taste, they are soluble in water, and they are crystalline in nature. So one thing about monosaccharide is that they are soluble in water but insoluble in organic solvents, right? An example of an organic solvent is when you are talking about the case of diethyl ether. They are organic solvents. You are talking about ethanol, they are organic solvents. So monosaccharides are soluble in water, but they are what? Insoluble in organic solvent. So that's just it about monosaccharide. Then let's move to the second case, which is the case of what? Of oligosaccharide. So one thing about oligosaccharide is that oligosaccharide contain 2 to 10 sugar units. That's something about oligosaccharide. 2 to 10 sugar units. Sometimes we could say oligosaccharide contain 2 to let me say 2 to 100 sugar units. Sometimes we could do say that, like oligosaccharide, it contain 2 to 10 sugar units. Sometimes we classify it like that, where some would be like 2 to 100, right? But here we are focusing on 2 to 10 units because that's actually what oligosaccharide is. Now, so oligosaccharides that are classified based on 2 sugar units. They are the one that are referred to as disaccharide. That is, they contain 2 sugar units, and I'm going to talk about them now. So let's simply move to disaccharide and give a brief explanation on disaccharide. So from there, then we can now talk about oligosaccharide as well, right? We can talk about oligosaccharide as well. So let's go. And let's talk about disaccharide. So one thing about disaccharide is that disaccharides are actually a types of carbohydrates that contain 2 sugar units. They contain 2 monosaccharides. Don't forget that mono simply means 1, while di simply means 2. So they contain 2 sugar units. That's one thing about disaccharide. And one thing is that the 2 sugar units are always linked with alpha glycosidic bond. That is with glycosidic bond. So disaccharides are joined together by what? That's the glycosidic bond. It's just like me talking about glucose. Glucose is actually what? A monosaccharide. Then I'm still adding it with another what? Glucose, which is another what? Monosaccharide. By the time I join them together, I'm going to form what? Disaccharide, right? But one thing about it is that whenever I join them together, I'm going to and alpha glycosidic bond, or simply let me just use the word glycosidic bond, will be formed. So that's one thing about it. So one thing about whenever we have 2 monosaccharides coming together, we are forming what? Disaccharide, right? And one thing about disaccharide is that they are also sweet to taste. They are sweet to taste, yes, right? They are soluble. Then they can be crystalline. They can be crystalline or amorphous. That is their structure. They can be crystalline or what? Or amorphous. Some of them are mostly referred to as what? Stable sugar. For example, the case of sucrose, right? It's mostly referred to as what? As stable sugar because it is very, very what? Sweet in nature. So that's something about disaccharide. They contain 2 sugar units, and the 2 sugar units are joined together by what? Glycosidic bond, right? So another thing I want you guys to understand as far as monosaccharide is concerned is that monosaccharides are also called simple sugar. Monosaccharides are also called simple sugar, right? So disaccharide is derived whenever you join 2 monosaccharides together. You are going to form what? A disaccharide. For example, you are adding glucose and glucose together, it's going to give you what? Disaccharide. And in that case, we'll be talking about reaction of what? Reaction of monosaccharide. So one thing is that whenever you are joining glucose and glucose together, which are monosaccharide, what type of reaction is that? It is simply refers to as what? Refers to as condensation reaction. It is simply condensation reaction. whereby you are what? You are joining two things together and you are removing what? A molecule of what? Of water. So whenever you remove a molecule of water, you are going to form what? A disaccharide. Then whenever you are going front, just like you are adding glucose and glucose together, that is condensation. Then whenever you are going back, that is you want to break down this disaccharide into two sugar units. That shows that you are going to what? You are going to be adding water. You will add water into what? Into this disaccharide. The water is going to what? To break the bond. And in that case, we call it what? Hydrolysis. We call it hydrolysis. That is hydrolysis reaction. Hydrolysis reaction. Right? So that's one thing about what? About disaccharide. So now let's simply talk about the example of disaccharide. Example of disaccharide. Let's talk about that one as well. Now let's talk about the example of disaccharide. So we have the case of sucrose, the first example. And one thing about sucrose is that it is mostly referred to as table sugar. Table sugar. That's what sucrose is. It is referred to as table sugar. It contains two monosaccharides, which are what? Which are glucose and what? And fructose. These are the constituents. Let me simply say the components of sucrose. Right? We have the case of glucose and also what? Fructose. Whenever you join them together, you're going to form what? Sucrose. We have the case of what? Of maltose. Maltose is mostly referred to as it is an intermediate in the digestion of what? Of carbohydrates actually, and it contains two glucose units, glucose and glucose. It contains glucose and glucose. Check it now, two glucose residue. Then we have the case of what? We have the case of, what is it called? Lactose. Lactose is mostly referred to as milk sugar, right? It's mostly referred to as milk sugar, right? And also it contains glucose and what? And galactose.